Hello everyone, and welcome back to my continuing review of Knights of the Frozen Throne. In this video, we're going to be looking at Paladin, Priest, and Rogue. So let's just jump right into the first card. And a reminder, they'll all be in alphabetical order by the cards within the classes. So if there's something you're looking for, you can find it in that order. So let's start with Arrogant Crusader. Starts the nay. So it's a 4-cost 5/2 with a death rattle. If it's your opponent's turn, summon a 2/2 ghoul. And, you know, obviously on its surface, a 4-cost 5/2 is not terribly impressive. But the fact that you are very likely to either get a profitable trade with it on your turn, you know, a 5-attack minion either goes face really hard or trades up with an opposing minion, it's a little bit more attractive. And if your opponent does decide, okay, well, I don't want to get hit for 5 in the face, I don't want to offer a trade on, you know, maybe my 5-drop, they're going to have to trade into this with something and then give you a 2/2 on their own turn. The problem, of course, is that they don't have to trade into it with very much. It only has 2 health. So you know, if they just have a 2-drop laying around, if they have a low-impact weapon or something like that, they can at least trade into the primary threat of the Arrogant Crusader, which is the upfront 5/2 body. You can sort of think of this as like a pseudo-piloted Shredder. Piloted Shredder was a 4/3 that always left behind about a 2/2 or 2/3, but this is more heavy-hitting minion, but you don't get to make that profitable trade in your own turn, which I do think makes it worse. I don't think this is as good as Piloted Shredder by any means, but if you're looking for a reasonably stable minion that can force your opponent to trade into it potentially, or give you a profitable trade in your turn, maybe it's something that's relatively attractive. It's not a card that I want to play in, say, a buff deck, because in either hand buff, you're not really getting tremendous value, and you're only hand buffing like the fragile portion of the body, which is the upfront 5/2, or in like say a Galvadon deck, because at 4 cost, it's actually around where in the curve you want to be playing a lot of your buffs. You want to be playing like the Silvermoon Portals or the Blessing of Kings, and it's not a particularly stable minion to buff, but it is a reasonably stable minion to expect to have something left over. So if say this costs 3 mana and was a bit smaller, but still had the same kind of effect, might be something that would be compelling for those types of decks. As it is, it's hard for me to imagine this really finding a home in a constructed deck outside of Arena, just because the actual impact in many games is not going to be that high. All right, next up we have Blackguard, which is a really interesting card. This is a 3/9, so it's a very tough minion to kill for 6 mana. And whenever your hero is healed, deal them much damage to a random enemy minion. So a couple of important notes here. This scales per the healing. So if you heal your hero for 20 with Forbidden Healing, you are hitting something your opponent controls for 20. And Paladins have a lot of kind of incremental bits of healing with like True Silver Champion. They have big heals like Forbidden Healing or Lay on Hands. They have some even big repeatable heals like Ragnar's Lightlord. And this is a card that is difficult for your opponent to remove and can provide you with just added value on more or less all of your healing effects, at least the ones that affect your hero. And that's, for a controlling Paladin deck, you're getting a lot of what you want out of a single card. You're getting like a reasonably big body. Like, for instance, this is a great minion for you to play and have your opponent try to kill for you not to be able to Spike Ridge Steed. It's a great minion to play, say coin out on turn 5 and then follow up with Ivory Knight, and you can pick Dino Size or whatever, and just blow up your opponent's stuff. That's giving you a lot of swing value to something that already has value in the long term with the healing. Also, turns out it's pretty good with the Paladin Death Knight, which we'll get to in a bit, thanks to that big lifesteal weapon. So I think this is a card that has a lot of potential. I think this is not a card that's obviously great, but I think just gives you a lot of additional impact on some of the cards that you're already looking to play in a controlling Paladin deck. I think this is a strong card. All right, next up we have Bulevar Fireblood. This is one of my picks for one of the most underrated cards in the set, and it's simply because people look at this and they only look at how unlikely you are to get the sort of dream scenarios. I think the video that this was revealed in showed like a Blood Knight coming down and removing a whole board of Divine Shields and Bulevar becoming enormous and just killing the opponent. That's not going to happen. It's not a reasonable expectation to have when you put this card in your deck. But this is a very durable minion. It says 7 health and Divine Shield for 5 mana. It's really difficult to kill. And having a very difficult to kill minion in a deck with Spike Ridge Steed, on 5 and then 6, is very valuable for just really making one of your best cards even better and more likely to actually come into play. I've seen some people say, well, if you really just want to maximize Spike Ridge Steed, you could always play like Stranglethorn Tiger, and that's true. you're not necessarily just looking for things that you can combine with Spikered Steed. It's not like, just having something like with a lot of health is just all Spikered Steed wants. But this is also, a card that you're going to get value out of from its ability on occasion. Obviously, a one hit makes it a 3/7, just losing its own Divine Shield. And then if you play this in the same turn that you have any other Divine Shield minion, of which there are now quite a few that are quite strong, I think, in Paladin, and also ways to find them, I think that you're going to get like a 5/7 minion, potentially, something really, really impactful and difficult to remove that has this very big upside. And I think that, yes, you don't have the absolute dream scenarios that it was revealed with, but I think just the baseline situation is actually pretty strong. And the upside to Bulevar's ability is very real. And I think this is a strong card that will see a significant amount of play. Next up, we have Chillblade Champion. This is a card that hand buff lovers everywhere are excited about, so that means me, as far as I know. Hand buff is a sort of strategy, or I don't know if it's really a strategy. It's the thing that Paladins tried to do in Minions of Gadgetzan that didn't really ever quite pan out. But two of the things that are extremely strong with buffs are Charge and Lifesteal. Lifesteal scales because obviously you get one hit with something and you're gaining that much life. You get two hits with something, you're gaining that much more life. Ta-da! Like, obviously something that's 2/2 is more than just a little bit better than this 1/1 with Lifesteal, because the additional value of the life goes up significantly. So buffing, like, say, a Wicker Flame Burn Bristle or this is much more powerful than buffing the average minion, because the repeated hits from the additional survivability of the minion, as well as the actual additional damage deals, are really impactful in terms of your ability to stay alive. And this card ensures that you always get at least one hit with that lifesteal. Sometimes your opponent would like ping and then Frostbolt or Fireball or whatever your Wicker Flame, you didn't get any life gain, or they have some other way of dealing with it that didn't give you life. Whereas this, you're always going to get the charge attack with the Chillblade Champion. And if you buff it in any way, whether it's hand buffs or you Blessing of Kings this or whatnot, that's a huge swing in terms of life total. Because if your opponent then has to attack into it and kill it, you're getting twice that much life, and that really adds up pretty quickly. So I think this card is actually pretty strong. I think it's deceptively powerful, because you look at it and you're like, oh, it's a 3/2 charge minion for 4, and well, there's Crocron Elite and there's Wolf Rod and all this, but Lifesteal I think is very underrated in the expansion in general, and specifically quite underrated on minions that are in a class that can be buffed regularly. I think that a lot of Paladin strength we've seen with Spikered Steed, I was just talking about Bulevar, is in the ability to enhance its minions these days, and that pairs so well with both of what's going on here that I think this card has a lot of potential. All right, next up we have Dark Conviction. This is in fact the Keepers of Uldaman having their secrets stolen, apparently, by people up in Northrend or whatever. This is kind of a weird card. Obviously, Keeper of Uldaman was powerful in part because it was a minion that had a body that came with the ability to neutralize one of your opponent's minions or to buff one of your own minions. But this is a spell, which means that it potentially pairs with Galvadon, and that's actually not a trivial thing in terms of the kind of things you'd be looking for in that sort of deck. This obviously works extremely well with Divine Shield minions, because much like Lifesteal, Divine Shield is an ability that scales better than linearly. You would either have a lot of attack on a Divine Shield minion, so you can connect with something big, and then okay, well, my 1/1 Divine Shield being a 3/3 is hugely different. It's the reason you have literally 1/1 Divine Shield costs 1 mana, 3/3 Divine Shield costs 4 mana. It's like, that's a huge gap between just what 1/1 and 3/3 costs. So I think this is a powerful card specifically with the Divine Shield minions, and those Divine Shield minions go potentially very well into a buff-focused deck, like the last Kaleidus or like Galvadon. So as for this is actually enough to make that legitimately competitive, probably not. But it is an extra tool for whether they're Divine Shield decks or buff decks to both increase their own ability to put on pressure and clock their opponent, as well as occasionally, I think most of this is going to be used for buffing your own things, your own small things, but occasionally your opponent plays a Lich King and you're like, all right, got to get rid of that. It's a 3/3 now. So I think this is going to be sort of a utility card that occasionally sees play, but certainly not stable. Next up we have Desperate Stand, another card for Divine Shield buff decks. This is I think a lot of cards in this set go very well with what some of these things that we're looking at right now are doing. I think that Divine Shield is obviously a mechanic in Paladin that's gotten a lot of attention in this set, and this is a card that isn't necessarily a Divine Shield card, but this obviously works particularly well with Divine Shield minions because Divine Shield minions that come back with 1 health are much sturdier than any other minion that can just be killed by any amount of damage. Obviously, Desperate Stand on your Tyrion is pretty powerful because, well, not only do you get the death rattle of I get my Ashbringer, but you get a 6/1 Divine Shield back that your opponent has to fight through once again. I don't think this card is going to be something that sees tons of play, but I do think that if there are Divine Shield buff type decks, this does have a home in those. And I think that there may be enough tools in this set to really create that as more of a sort of mini strategy, at least within Paladin. Next up, we have Howling Commander. This is a 3-mana 2/2 that draws you a Divine Shield minion from your deck. So another card that can go into sort of a mini Divine Shield theme. Not necessarily a card that has to go into a deck with tons of Divine Shield minions. This could very easily go into a deck that has Wickerflame and Tyrion, and half the time it gets you Wickerflame, half the time it gets you Tyrion. And that's fine. That is potentially like good enough for the justification of playing this card. Give you a little bit of card advantage. Obviously the 2/2 body for 3 isn't really that exciting. But it does give you access to specific cards in your deck if you want to find them more often. And obviously, Tyrion is usually a card you want to find in most of your games. I don't think you'll generally want to play like 2 of these in a deck that like just has a Tyrion, because this is going to be really low impact once you've drawn your Tyrion. You won't do anything. But maybe if you're playing a N'Zoth deck, you really want to make sure you always have your Tyrion. So you're basically playing effectively 3 Tyrions in your deck. So you just know that it's going to be a card that you get in time for your late game power. So I think this is a really nice card. I think there's a lot of cards like this in the set that are kind of build around ish, but not necessarily like purely like linear or parasitic type build arounds. This can go into any deck that cares about Divine Shield minions in any way, whether it's because it wants to play a lot of them or whether because it wants to play a couple of specific ones. And I think that's a really cool kind of design, and I hope to see more of it. Next up, we have Light's Sorrow. This is more of a card that wants to go into your Divine Shield deck. Obviously, this is a weapon that's not particularly powerful unless you have a significant number of Divine Shield minions already. If you just have 1 or 2, it's like, okay, well, you're playing a 2/4 weapon for 4, or a 3/4 weapon for 4 is starting to sound really good. But if you can get this higher, if you can get this to a 4/4 or 5/4 or 6/4, whatever, that's super strong. Obviously, those are kind of pie in the sky numbers, but I think where this really starts to be attractive is once it starts to have 3 power. That's about the amount that you'd feel like you could pay for that kind of weapon. Because getting 4 swings with a weapon that has 2 or 3 or 4 power is pretty strong. That's a powerful card. But obviously, you get the weakest swings up front, so the power that you're actually getting for like initial board clear, unless you're immediately getting Divine Shield trades off the turn that you play it, it's going to be at its lowest. So it can be difficult to really justify playing this like over, say, True Silver Champion. And you're also very likely going to be playing Rallying Blade in your Divine Shield deck, because that's a very powerful effect when you do have Divine Shield. It's kind of funny that this and Rallying Blade kind of do different things. Rallying Blade is like, preserve your Divine Shields and then play your Rallying Blade. I guess this kind of wants you to do the same thing. Preserve your Divine Shields, play your Light's Sorrow, and then trade them off. So it's not really that different. It is kind of, it cares that they are now interacting rather than that they still have the Divine Shield immediately when you play them. This one does have the benefit that you can then play a thing with a Divine Shield after you've played Light's Sorrow, and then have that Divine Shield popped, which is obviously not true in the case of buffing with Rallying Blade. So that's a bit of a benefit there. But anyway, it's hard for me to imagine wanting to put like 2 of these into a deck, and it's hard for me to imagine wanting to put one of them over a True Silver Champion, just because True Silver Champion is so good. But maybe there's a deck that has enough Divine Shields that it's naturally playing, but this ends up being more powerful than one of those. But I'm not super confident that'll happen. All right, next up we have Righteous Protector. This is actually probably one of my favorite cards in the set. Super simple, obviously. 1/1 Divine Shield for 1 with Taunt. And the fact that it has Taunt is huge, because Taunt Divine Shield is a really powerful combination. We saw a Noyotron back in Goblin vs. Gnomes that would somehow just prevent tons of damage in the mid-game against like mid-range decks and such. Imagine this in sort of the middle turns of the game against Pirate Warrior. They very often have just individual big things they can swing through. They have Arcanite Reapers, they have Frothing Berserkers, and whatever else. Heroic Strikes. Having to send 2 of those into a Righteous Protector is tremendously costly to them. And it's possible that, rather than, okay, I'm going to try and fight all of your minions like sort of on a level playing field. It's like I'm going to make it really difficult for you to fight through my minions, and then maybe I can use buffs or whatever else to help fight against your bigger stuff. Regardless, I really like that this is giving sort of a additional Argent Squire to Paladin, which kind of wants to have the Divine Shield stuff going on. It's also just obviously a little bit better because the taunt really is very relevant in the middle to late turns of the game, even on a small minion. So I'm really excited about this card, and I think we'll see a lot of play. And last but certainly not least is Uther of the Ebon Blade, who is a 9-cost hero that obviously gives you 5 armor. With Battlecry, equip a 5/3 lifesteal weapon. And that by itself, you basically immediately have a 10-point life swing once you play Uther. Like, think about comparing Uther with, like, Lay on Hands. Okay? A lot of people will play Lay on Hands in a lot of control Paladin decks. And in part, it's because of the card advantage that you gain by actually drawing 3 cards. But a big part of it is the life swing. And Uther is, for 1 more mana, turning that life swing into also a weapon attack that's available the same turn, and additional weapon attacks that also will heal you, and, by the way, an upgraded hero power. And that hero power, Horseman of the Apocalypse, is awesome to me. The primary value in this hero power is going to be that it gives you 2/2s. Your hero power name makes 2/2s instead of 1/1s. 2/2s are dramatically more powerful than 1/1s. It sounds weird to say, but because they aren't killed by pings, they aren't killed by just incidental damage nearly as often as 1/1s are. 2/2s are much more likely to be able to survive. And obviously the fact that, well, if they do survive, you just win the game. You get all 4 of the Horsemen of the Apocalypse to play, and you win the game, and that's super awesome. Like I said, I don't think that's going to be the primary way that that's powerful. It's mostly going to be powerful because you're just making minions that are difficult for your opponent to kill, and also you have this like really swingy, lifesteal weapon, etc. But it's also just cool. So this is a card that I think is very good. I think this card is very powerful in any kind of controlling or even like mid-range Paladin deck. I think this is a card that can just go into a deck. A lot of the death in here is, it feels like you really need to build around them in like a pretty meaningful way. You want your deck to really support what the Death Knight is doing. Uther really isn't one of those. Uther just makes your hero better and gives you, a weapon and armor and this upgraded hero power. Everything you're doing is the same except better. So that's pretty great and can really feel like it has a home in just about any Paladin deck. So I think this card is very powerful. I think it will see a significant amount of play. All right, next up we have the Priest cards, and we will start with Acolyte of Agony. Now, Acolyte of Agony is a lifesteal minion, and I've talked up quite a bit how I think lifesteal is a powerful mechanic, but I think it's at one of its weakest points in Priest. I think that lifesteal is great when either life gain for your class, like healing for your class, is scarce, like perhaps in Warlock or Hunter or Rogue. Those are all classes where I think lifesteal is very powerful. But I think in Priest, where you have lots of tools to keep yourself alive, including your hero power, as well as cards like Priest, the Feast, and whatever else, it's a lot less impressive of a tool. Also, Priest doesn't really have ways to buff the attack of its minions. It only really buffs health. And while that can lead to having a sort of a sticky lifesteal minion hanging out for a while and healing you multiple times, and that can be powerful, it doesn't have the same oomph as like buffing up a lifesteal minion with like Blessing of Kings or hand buff to like connect for big heals initially, and not have to worry about keeping the minion around in order to preserve your life. Because spending your resources, say your hero power, healing your lifesteal guy, well, you could just be healing yourself instead in a lot of cases. And yes, it can add up over time to be stronger, but you'd rather just get that individual big hit and not have to work on keeping that guy around. At least that's sort of my thoughts on lifesteal and Priest. I don't really think this card is super exciting to me. You need to do a lot of work to make it better than just an Earthring Farseer, basically. And while sometimes it could be, I'm not really sure it's worth it given the other options available to the class. Next up, we have one of the craziest cards really in Hearthstone history, which is Archbishop Benedictus. I think Mike Dene described this as this was like a design that someone threw out. It's like, can we actually do this? It's like, well, yeah, I guess we can do this. And this is I think pretty clearly a card that just exists to do something crazy, just exists to do something wild, to show, yes, we can do this. If you want to do totally outrageous and wacky things in Hearthstone, the possibilities are there. I don't think Archbishop Benedictus is a good card. I think that maybe there's a world where you're playing, super fatigue-oriented games, and other people are playing cards that add cards to their decks. So, all right, you feel the need to go and play Archbishop Benedictus, but I think there's a lot better ways you can end games rather than just trying to fatigue your opponent. I think that fatigue is really kind of an overrated component of the way that most Hearthstone games play out. There's certainly been times and decks that have had matchups where fatigue was a major component, like old school Control Warrior mirrors, where people didn't actually have ways to end the game. But we've come a long way since then. That's not really the way that a lot of those games play out. Now you have either N'Zoth Control Warrior or Quest Control Warrior or whatever. Basically decks that are actually doing things that proactively end the game rather than just trying to kill every single thing that their opponent plays. And Priest, I feel like those games typically don't exist anymore either. Even like Priest Control mirrors, it's usually like, okay, some crazy Lyra turn or some unanswered, inner fired threat or something like that, rather than just dragging out to both players totally being exhausted of resources. And frankly, I think Hearthstone's better this way. I think just whoever can somehow get the most cards in their deck is kind of a silly way for games to be decided. But if there are matchups that do seem to be coming down to that, playing one Archbishop Benedictus in your deck is something that can just win you those games. So it's an interesting option to have available if things go that way, but I don't think things are going to go that way in Hearthstone, because I think sort of the equilibrium is moving in the other direction toward more interactive and conclusive game-winning cards rather than fatigue being what decides even control matchups. Next up we have Devouring Mind. This is another card that if you're looking for ways to win long control games is a powerful one. I think this is an interesting card in like a toolbox deck with Shadow Visions. It's obviously something that can generate a lot of resources. And one of the things that I've actually often found when I'm playing Shadow Visions decks, especially like Kazaka Shadow Visions decks that aren't necessarily like an inner fire deck, that you don't necessarily have things that you're like looking for sort of in general. Like oftentimes you find that you're I'm gonna wait and maybe I try and Shadow Visions for Free from Amber, or I wait until I get my Elise and Goro pack shuffled into my deck. But if you just had something in these kind of like semi-controlling mid-range-ish priest decks that you could more consistently just find with Shadow Visions for value, I think that is a powerful tool in some of these mid-range or controlling matchups. And Devour Mind is certainly very powerful in those instances. Thoughtsteal's been a card that has had pretty big impact, at least early in Hearthstone's history, on control matchups because it gave you additional resources without actually driving you further into fatigue. It's funny that I'm talking about that just after talking about how fatigue isn't a big deal these days nearly as much. But this can be a value generation tool that maybe you play one copy of Divisions for. Maybe you just really want to play a crazy steal your stuff deck, and you can play this and Thoughtsteal and Shifting Shade and Crystalline Oracle, whatever. But obviously, using one card to generate 3 cards from your opponent's deck rather than 2 cards makes this a stronger card in long games than Thoughtsteal. And generally, when you're looking for an effect that is essentially generating value in long games, the cost of it being 5 versus 3 isn't nearly as impactful in terms of how much you want it compared to the overall result. You'd rather get 3 cards than 2 cards because the extra 2 mana in that kind of game is rarely that big a deal. So I think that this may sort of replace Thoughtsteals in people's decks who are looking to get that effect in those controlling matchups. Next up we have Embrace Darkness. This is a really interesting card because it's obviously kind of like a mind control, except your opponent can do something about it. One of the big things about mind control, your opponent plays a big thing, and then you take it, and they don't get to do anything with it, and it's like, oh well, this sucks. But with Embrace Darkness, it costs way less than mind control. It costs 6 mana, but your opponent has a turn to do something about the fact that you're going to steal it. And obviously, this is a card that's much more powerful if you're playing a more reactive version of Priest. If you're playing a very spell-heavy, controlling version of Priest, this is going to be much more likely to be a good card when you play it than if you're playing a minion-focused version, because your opponent could then just attack their minion into that you're trying to steal into your minions, and you're much less likely to get it, or at least get it in an undamaged and pristine form. It obviously also lets them potentially use their removal spells on their own minion and even get like death rattles and such. Like if your opponent can somehow kill their own Tyrion, they'll get the Ashbringer, you won't get it, like the mind control essentially guarantees. It's obviously a huge difference as well. But I mean, most significantly, I think that this is just another tool for those Shadow Visions type decks. And in many cases, it felt like when I was playing those style of decks that mind control is kind of too expensive for a lot of what I wanted. But I did have tons of tools for like keeping myself alive, and I feel like you could use your life total as a resource to let your opponent hit you with a big minion and then steal it with Embrace Darkness. And having something that you can take, say, your opponent's Primordial Drake, You know, Primordial Drake is a big problem for a lot of priest decks because, well, it's a 4 attack minion, so you can't use any of your Shadow Words on it. 8 health is a lot to try and kill with anything. It's immune to Dragonfire Potion, and this is a great way to potentially deal with it, because it's not like it's hitting you very hard, but you just don't really have a great way to actually get off the board. And, you know, Embrace Darkness, you know, hero power yourself, all right, that's now yours, and the game can change pretty significantly. So I do think this is a card that's pretty attractive, and I'm certainly going to be experimenting with it quite a bit in my controlling priest decks. Next up, we have Eternal Servitude. This is basically a Resurrect that you can play in the same deck as Northshire Cleric. One of the big issues with Resurrect mechanics, you know, both Resurrect and Onyx Bishop, has always been that it really impedes your ability to put lower impact minions in your deck, because if you do have those cheap minions, it can really ruin your ability to get value off of your Resurrect effects. Obviously, it costs a lot more than those Resurrect effects, but it's a lot more consistently able to do what you want. Resurrect, for instance, with Barnes. The number of times you'd Barnes out Ysera. Your Ysera would die, and your Barnes would die, and you'd Resurrect Barnes. It's like, Barnes, stop hogging the spotlight. This show is about Ysera. Tonight, a tale of dragons denied. That's what this is. But Eternal Servitude, no. If your Ysera and your Barnes die, you can turn Eternal Servitude, and you're guaranteed to get back Ysera, because it's going to be among those discovered cards at that stage of the game. Obviously, if the game goes on longer, you know, more things die, it gets more muddied, but you know, this is a very powerful card, I think. And there's both Barnes and another card that I think we're going to talk about momentarily that really kind of make that style of priest deck feel like it has more power to it. And I'm really excited about this card. And I also think this is another card that's great in a Shadow Visions type deck, because this is effectively a threat you can Shadow Visions for. And that's something that you often want in controlling matchups is, you know, you Shadow Visions like, okay, well, your options are, you know, Holy Nova, Shadow Word Pain, Shadow Word Death. You don't want any of those. You want to be able to actually have something which is generating value or putting pressure on your opponent, and something which can potentially bring back a Ysera or a Lich King or whatever is definitely that. And I think Eternal Servitude is a card that, like every other priest card I'm sure I'm going to say, I'm going to be experimenting with, and I think is going to be pretty powerful. Next up, we have one of the great minions to Servitude back, which is Obsidian Statue. This is not only just a really impactful immediate big minion, because it has not only Taunt, not only Lifesteal, but Death Rattle, destroy a random enemy minion. Now, this is a really powerful defensive minion. Obviously costs 9 mana, but it is likely to really help you stabilize your board quite readily. It also, because it does have Taunt, makes a little bit more attractiveness to playing, say, Stonehill Defender in Priest, because now, you know, there's basically Tortola and this. I think there might be one other Priest taunt, but I don't think so. It's at least not jumping to my mind right now, but potentially a very high impact minion that you can get off of Stonehill Defender in the class. The fact that it is a Death Rattle minion also is another tool for the Priest quest deck, which up until now I feel like has lacked good, big, impactful things. Also is very good with N'Zoth. You know, N'Zoth bringing back things that immediately have an impact, and obviously a Taunt, Lifesteal, Death Rattle, kill your stuff minion is a pretty big impact when you bring it back from N'Zoth. Just very, very powerful. And, you know, lots of ways, whether it's with Barnes or with, you know, some of the other cheat your minion into play cards, you can get this into play quickly and then start resurrecting it. It can really make life tough for your opponent. So I'm really excited about this card. It is very expensive. You know, 9 is a lot to pay. But I think that this is actually a min that's worth the 9 mana, especially if you have the right support for it. So I'm really excited for this card. Next up, we have Shadow Ascendant. This is very different than most Priest stuff we've seen. Most Priest stuff that we've seen in terms of like minion-based Priest cards tend to be built around having a minion that you're making powerful. Whether it's, you know, buffing up your minion's health with, you know, Powered Shield, Cabal Talon Priest, whatever else. And, you know, buffing its attack with Inner Fire, whatever, healing a minion. It's usually focused on like making a relatively powerful minion. Shadow Ascendant is obviously something which you are spreading out the love. You know, you play your Shadow Ascendant potentially on turn 2 after a Northshire Cleric, say, and that's pretty powerful. You're making a 2/4 Northshire Cleric, which makes it much more threatening, much harder for people to remove, obviously much better able to you know, trade and then use its hero power, or rather use your hero power to heal it and draw cards. But the Shadow Ascendant itself is, you know, it's kind of this facilitator minion, which is not really mostly what we've seen. You know, I guess it's kind of somewhere like in the realm of like a Cabal Talon Priest in that way. Mostly Priest hasn't typically buffed its minion's attack. So this makes this very much an outlier in terms of that kind of effect. Priest buffing their minion's attack is actually quite powerful. I remember Velen's Chosen was one of the best cards in Priest for a long time. And it's kind of quietly one of the best cards, too. Because it allowed you, say, playing like Dragon Priest or any kind of Priest deck, really, to have a small minion that remained a threat for the early to middle turns of the game, because at any point you could just buff it and trade it into your opponent's bigger things and eat them in most cases. This doesn't quite give you the trading potential, but I mean, we're even close to a Velen's Chosen. You don't get the immediate buff. You can't like immediately attack and heal. But it does potentially allow you to kind of snowball those sort of early starts in a different way. My guess is this card probably won't be that good. I don't feel like there's enough support for like the early game minion strategy in Priest, unless maybe you have this with more cards similar to like Zombie Chow or whatever else. You really want like just high health minions to get the buff on, because obviously the attack buff and the health buff are more valuable on things that are more likely to stay alive, which is generally going to be high health minions, which Priest wants anyway. So. But yeah, I'm unconvinced that this card has enough support to really make a sort of minion-based Priest deck work, but I'm interested in what other kind of support that strategy gets going forward. All right, next up we have Shadow Essence. This is kind of the other Barnes-type card that I was talking about earlier. This is really interesting because you summon a 5/5 copy of a random minion in your deck. My understanding, and I could be wrong, my understanding is that this minion will then behave as if it were like a Barnes copy if it does die, and then so you can potentially resurrect it earlier on. So this is multiple things, including multiple non-legendary versions of the Barnes effect that you can use to include in your deck to get high-powered minions with, say, end-of-turn effects like the Lich King or Ysera, or Death Rattle effects in your deck. And it's another threat that you can Shadow Visions for. This is kind of like in, say, a Priest Quest deck, a Death Rattle minion in many ways you can Shadow Visions for, and that I think is very strong because you give yourself more access to those Death Rattle minions, more just flexibility in general, and also potentially the ability to put out like a 5/5 powerful Death Rattle minion that's normally very small. So I think this card is quite good. I think it's obviously by itself it's not really efficient. A 5/5 for 6 isn't really great, but if you're getting a 5/5 that's connected to an ability that's you're getting earlier in the game than you normally might with something like the Lich King or Ysera, or that's attached to, say, a Northshire Cleric. It's obviously a pretty powerful thing to have being a 5/5 in your deck. So I'm really excited to explore this card, and I think it's quite good. Next up, we have one of my favorite cards in the set, of course, which is Shadow Reaper Anduin. It's 8 cost with a battle cry of destroy all minions with 5 or more attack. Kind of like a Light Bomb, Dragonfire Potion type effect, though it does affect dragons, but it doesn't affect Twilight Drakes. Those are still the great nemesis of the Priest, despite Shadow Reaper Anduin's best efforts. Obviously gives you 5 armor like all the other ones. It then gives you the hero power Void Form, which is kind of like Shadow Form except with a little bit of twist. You can deal 2 damage, but whenever you play a card, you refresh the ability. And if there's ever been a card that screams out, play me with Raza, it's this. Obviously having to spend 2 mana on 2 damage, it's basically just Shadow Form. But the resetting aspect of this is what makes that hero power powerful, which is way better if your hero power costs 0. So I am kind of a little bit disappointed that this isn't a card that you actually want to play in a deck that already has Shadow Form, because your Shadow Form that you've switched to isn't going to really do anything, and playing Shadow Form after the fact is, well, frankly, just silly. But it is obviously sort of embracing the sort of Shadow Priest fantasy of, I get to like blast things with dark magic or whatever. And I think the front part, the battle cry of Anduin, is very good for like catching you up in games where you might be very far behind, which is something that Priest sometimes finds itself in, especially without actual Light Bomb. If you're playing as Jade Druid and they have a bunch of big guys in play, you can just play your Death Knight, blow up their entire board, and then get to work on their life total with your hero power, assuming of course that you have Raza and can just start doing it for free. But one of the problems that Priest often has is actually ending the game. You can often find yourself in positions where, if you're not playing a Shadow Priest style deck, that you need to establish, minions for too long to actually get in the damage that you need. But with Void Form, your opponent isn't going to just be sitting there at 4 over the course of a game, and you have no way to burn them out. Every single card is now burn spell at their face, especially, again, if you have Raza. So I love Raza, Kazaka style Priest decks so much. I love the, variance in gameplay of, you have so many different cards in your deck, you have to find uses for all of them at different times, which obviously makes this card so much more attractive to me because it works so specifically well with that style of decks. So I'm sure this is one of the cards I'm going to be crafting probably in gold on day 1 of the expansion. I'm not convinced that it's going to be as good for other people, but it's certainly a card that I am very much looking forward to because I'm going to have a lot of fun with it. And lastly, we have Spirit Lash. This is actually one of the first cards revealed from Knights of the Frozen Throne. Just lifesteal, deal 1 damage to all minions for 2. This is an interesting card because Priest has kind of suffered for good, cheap AoE. Generally, Priest has relied on Wild Pyromancer for AoE effects earlier in the game to kill smaller minions, and then had to wait until like 5 mana for Holy Nova or Excavated Evil, or 6 mana for Light Bomb or Dragonfire Potion. So having a cheap AoE, especially a cheap AoE that heals you in a world where there's lots of decks that have a bunch of aggressive minions, is very valuable. And I think that this is a card that could really help Priest decks against some of those aggressive decks, where it can somewhat struggle to actually keep up. This is obviously a very powerful tool if you combine it with spell power, and there's actually some interesting inclusions for possible spell power options in Knights of the Frozen Throne as well, on top of just obviously the Blood Mage Thalnos, which you see in so many decks that are looking for just a little bit of spell power. This scales so well with spell power because your opponent has a board full of living manas, and you're like, okay, I'll Spirit Lash them with Blood Mage Thalnos, and suddenly everything's dead. You gain a ton of life, and it doesn't matter that your opponent just Savage Roared down to 2 last turn. They are now totally out of reach, being able to kill you. That said, 1 damage by itself isn't really enough to kill most things. You can kill like a Patches and a N'Zoth First Mate and heal yourself back up, and that's nice for getting the breathing room against those sort of aggressive decks. But you're going to really need to pair it with things because, generally you're going to need to do like 2 damage to kill a board full of totems, or even like 3 damage to kill, a board full of buffed Fireflies or whatever out of Aggro Druid. So I think that, this may not quite have the impact that a lot of people have wanted it to have, but it is a great card, obviously, if you're looking to pair it with Wild Pyromancer to increase those potential ceilings you have in your burn. You just need to be careful you don't just kill your Pyromancer then not get the future triggers. So I think this is definitely a card that has a potential home if the metagame remains aggressive, and when has the Hearthstone metagame not remained aggressive? So that would lead me to think that Spirit Lash is likely to see a lot of play. All right, next up we have Rogue, and we are starting off with probably the least impressive of the Rogue cards from my evaluation, which is Bone Baron. Just a 5-cost 5/5 with Death Rattle, add 2 1/1 skeletons to your hand. And this just isn't a particularly impressive card to me. 5-cost 5/5 is not super exciting for stats, and the Death Rattle, you're getting a couple of cheap cards. You're getting 1-cost 1/1s, which is useful in Rogue for combo and things like that. But if this were even just like Death Rattle, put 2 1/1 skeletons in play, I'm not convinced that it would necessarily be like that good. It would probably be pretty good in some spots. But you have to spend the mana to replay them later. It's kind of just, I think, re-emphasizing the bit of a Death Rattle theme that they're looking for Rogue to have, obviously with stuff like Unearthed Raptor in previous sets and Roll the Bones, which is in the set we'll get to. But yeah, I just don't think this card is really up to snuff in terms of what you're looking for. Maybe if you do just want a lot of Death Rattle minions in your deck, this can be one of them, but I'm not impressed. Next up, we do have a card that I think is awesome, which is probably the best name in the set. Maybe not the best. That's got to be Arphis, I think. But Doomerang, it's one of the best for sure, which is 1-cost, throw your weapon at a minion. It deals its damage, then returns to your hand. So first of all, I think it's just really funny that because Hearthstone's a digital game, you can just have the words throw your weapon at a minion, rather than saying like your weapon deals its damage to target minion. Then put your weapon, whatever, the sort of incredibly long and complicated exact rules text that people seem to want every Hearthstone card to have. I just think this card is super sweet. And on top of just being super sweet, I think it's actually good. I think that being able to enable more ways to utilize your weapons, both in terms of not having to take damage when you attack with them, which is one of the problems that Rogue has, because it doesn't have armor or healing or big taunts or anything in its kind of class pool of stuff that it does. Have the kind of active defense that I can use my weapon to hit that without taking damage because I throw it. That's just cool, And there's also the weapons like Shadow Blade, which we'll get to in a bit, that have effects that you want to replay them. So being able to reset your weapons with their durability, like an Assassin's Blade or whatever, being able to reset a Shadow Blade and get another immune swing. Those are just upside to this, and I think that's really cool. I love all the sort of pieces of this. It's also just a 1-cost spell, which can be quite relevant in Rogue as well. If you need to activate combo with Auctioneer, whatever else. I think this card is just great. Everything about it, the name, the effect, the ways it synergizes with other things that Rogue has going on. I love it. Next up, we have another Rogue weapon type card, and I like, by the way, that they're going in kind of this direction with Rogue, giving them reasons to actually play weapons in their decks, which is Leeching Poison. In so many cases, Rogues have had like a number of weapon cards, not a ton, but a number of weapon cards that just never really saw play because, well, you just had your dagger as a weapon, and replacing your dagger, or not daggering up was kind of not really necessarily the most efficient thing you could be doing resource-wise. And Leeching Poison, though, obviously gives you a reason to play weapons that hit harder than your dagger. And it also just like changes the incentives for how you want to manage weapons. Obviously this is particularly good if you can get a high durability weapon in play and buff it, and then give it lifesteal. It's like this could theoretically, like say an Assassin's Blade with Deadly Poison, this could be 2 mana for 20 life. And that's obviously just super strong, right? Obviously that's kind of the top end that you can realistically expect. But if you even just play this with a Shadow Blade, that's 2 mana for 6 life, which isn't great. It's a Holy Light or whatever, but that's the sort of the not the floor, because the floor is obviously like you have to use it with your hero power. But that's a pretty nice heal option in a class that previously had struggled quite a bit with it. I don't know how many Leeching Poisons you can play for how many weapons you're playing and things like that. Do you want to be playing with Deadly Poison to increase the heals you're getting from this or whatever? Like there's lots of moving parts there, and I think that's interesting from a deck building perspective, trying to figure out how many weapons you need per Doomerang and Leeching Poison and what weapon buffs you want and things like that. So I'm really excited for this card because I love playing the sort of mid-range controlling style Rogue decks rather than just like tempo combo types, and this is the sort of card that can help enable them. Next up we have Lilian Voss, which is very funny because it's literally just a WoW character that was a play on a Magic card name. This is Liliana Voss, the Planeswalker, the Black Planeswalker, and now it's actually a card in Hearthstone, which is kind of a game based on Magic. It's like different riffs and different things, but has nothing to do with Liliana Voss in Magic, who's like kind of a necromancer. This Lilian Voss is apparently a thief. And Battlecry, replace spells in your hand with random spells from your opponent's class. So there's a couple things that are interesting about this. One is, in like a Thief Rogue deck, you can very often end up with Swashbuckler or Shaku or whatever else getting you cards that aren't particularly effective. Maybe you pick up a Shatter, maybe you pick up some removal spell against a control deck that you're not really likely to use. Being able to transform those cards into new cards with Lilian Voss is pretty sweet. There's also just the fact that in just a regular Rogue deck, in the late game, cards like Backstab or Preparation or even Coins or whatever may not be valuable, in the absence of Auctioneer, of course, and you would rather replace them with something new. You can very often find yourself, or I very often found myself playing like Jade Rogue, and I'd like Mimic Pod late in the game, and my Mimic Pod would hit Backstab. I'm like, well, I lost because now I just have these super low impact tempo cards at the stage of the game where that's not what's going on. That's not what the game is about. When Lilian Voss can be great at actually replacing those. Obviously works well in like Burgly Bully. You pick up a bunch of coins off Burgly Bully. Maybe you're still better off just transferring them into actual spells from your own deck with Auctioneer. But the ability to like curve Lilian Voss even with your own spells in your deck, like this is like you can curve Lilian Voss without having played your own rogue spells into Ethereal Peddler, and suddenly you turn all of your rogue spells that were in your hand into discounted versions of your opponent's class spells, like just on turn 4, turn 5, and that's very often going to be pretty powerful. So I'm excited for this card. I think it's likely going to be at least very fun. I don't know if it's really going to show up in top tier rogue competitive decks, because I think those are still likely to be built around Gadget and Auctioneer, and this is clearly not a very good card for that deck. But I'm certainly going to play with it, and it's going to be sweet. Next up we have Plague Scientist, which this is a card that was revealed fairly early on, and I talked about it a bit on Omnistone, where it's hard for me to think of this going into a deck that doesn't already run and want Vilespine Slayers. And yes, maybe you can play this in addition to Vilespine Slayers. You're playing against a lot of like mid-range minions. It's obviously a pretty powerful effect if you have minions just kind of sitting around. Like specifically, I think this is a card that may be good in Jade Rogue. Jade Rogue has the Jade Swarmers that are often just sitting around stealth, which makes Plague Scientist have pretty easy targets to bump into your opponent's Jade minions in the mid game or whatever to kill them. And I can certainly see that being a powerful tool in that deck if mid-range decks are kind of the decks to beat. But I don't know that you're necessarily going to have room for this and Vilespine Slayer and the sort of rest of the Jade package and whatever else. And I don't know that there's going to be a world where you want that many things to just kill mid-range minions, especially that require various setup. Like, this is not only combo, but combo have a friendly minion that can attack this turn most of the time, and your opponent have a target for it. There's a lot of setup there. But that said, Vilespine Slayer is a super powerful card, this being kind of an analog of Vilespine Slayer. In those matchups where you're both kind of likely to be sitting around with minions, can be very strong. So I think this card has potential, but I think it was kind of overrated when it was first revealed. I do think it'll be gross in Arena, though, because Vilespine Slayer is probably like just the most powerful card from Goro in Arena, and this even being a poor analog of that makes it very strong. Next up we have Roll the Bones, which is draw a card. If it has Death Rattle, cast this again for 2 mana. I think someone did some math on this, and you need to play like at least like a dozen or plus Death Rattles before you're, likely to draw, like, for this to be like a profitable thing over like a Shiv. And obviously Shiv is 2 mana, deal 1 damage, draw a card. And this, you have to, like, half your deck has to be Death Rattles for you to like have a better than 50% chance of drawing a Death Rattle from the first effect. Then of course you do have the chance to draw again, which does sort of change the averages more than just like, okay, well, half of them have to be. It's something like a dozen, I think, to have an average of 2 draws per this. And that's a lot. And, Rogue does have this kind of mini Death Rattle theme going on, but I don't know that there's necessarily that many Death Rattle cards that you want to be playing in your deck. I mean, maybe you're playing with, Undercity Huckster and Jade Swarmer, and then there's a few more things. I haven't really been impressed by, like I said, like Bone Baron, not a card that I'm really necessarily going to be looking to play in order to justify including Roll the Bones, because I think you're sort of neutering the rest of the power of your deck too much to get sort of card draw. But that said, Rogue, combo style Rogue decks do kind of suffer from card draw. There is Mimic Pod, but Mimic Pod's a weird card because Rogues are often a class in decks that have kind of polarized cards. Something like the Backstab I mentioned earlier. That's a card that if you draw in the early game is great, but if you draw in the late game is like pretty poor. So Mimic Podding into that is like particularly bad because you've now spent a bunch of mana getting something and 2 copies of a thing that's not really very impactful. Whereas this, you're obviously not really having the same sort of polarization issue with just duplicating a low impact thing. It's obviously polarized in terms of the actual results of whether you hit a Death Rattle minion or not. But I do think that maybe you can be playing a Death Rattle deck in Rogue that does want this if there's enough support in the Death Rattle pool. I haven't seen that yet, so not something I expect to see at least right out of the gates. All right, next up we have Runeforge Haunter, which is a 5/3 for 4 with during your turn your weapon doesn't lose durability. When I first saw this, I was thinking, okay, this is a card that I would want to play in like my Shadow Blade deck or whatever that I want to use to kill my opponent's minions and just keep using my weapon. And I didn't really like it because it felt like, okay, well, this is not a particularly well-statted minion for a controlling deck with only 3 health for 4 mana. But then I think it was Firebat who brought up, well, no, this isn't a card that you want to play in any kind of like mid-range or controlling rogue. This is a card you want to play in an aggressive rogue deck that just plays a weapon, punches your opponent in the face with it, and then plays this guy the next turn and gets another punch with it. So effectively is just, this is assuming you have, say, a Shadow Blade in play, something that does, or Deadly Poison Weapon or something, on average of like 3 damage. This is just giving you another 3 damage attack when it's able to combine with that. And then, it's actually like a very damaging minion if it does manage to hit your opponent. So if you're able to like protect this guy with a weapon swing, maybe he actually does 5, and you get another swing of your weapon to kill another opposing minion. So I think that you need to have this right perspective. I think this is like an aggro rogue type card. It's an aggro weapon rogue type card, and I think it's a powerful one in the right context. I think that just giving you bonus swings with like a deadly poison weapon can be a really big deal and can ultimately do a lot of damage. And I like the sort of during your turn thing being like the rogue, not necessarily like defensive thing, but it is somewhat. Like I like that rogue has like active defense in the set, and also things that this is clearly like, oh, I'm sneaking up on you, and thus like I'm able to get a better attack on you. It doesn't cost me something, and I like that being kind of a thing that rogue is doing, kind of giving them more of that stealthy, tricky feel. All right, next up we have Shadow Blade. I've mentioned the card a number of times already, and I think this is one of the most important rogue cards in the entire set. Rogue has always suffered, basically because it hasn't been able to heal itself. And I think that Rogue pretty much shouldn't really heal itself. That's not what rogues do. They are sneaky, they are tricky, they're stealthy. And this, I think, is a great way of illustrating that. You get to choose the sort of engagement on your turn. As soon as you play your like Shadow Blade, you sneak up on someone, you stab them, they don't get to attack you back. cool, you're immune. That's sweet. And I think that this is not only just a very cool thematic card, but also just a very powerful card, because giving rogues, especially now that there's sort of more weapon use tools, a weapon like this that can allow them to play that sort of mid-rangey controlling game without just bleeding out from their life total, getting whittled down every time they do attack a minion, is very powerful and definitely opens up a lot of space for what the class can do. So this is definitely one of the rogue cards in the set, if not the rogue card in the set that I am the most excited about, and I think it's very good. So next up we have Spectral Pillager. This is a 6-cost 5/5 with combo deal damage equal to the number of other cards you've played this turn. This is actually, I think, a card that wasn't revealed prior to the final revealed stream, and then wasn't revealed on the final revealed stream, which I think is kind of the way of Blizzard saying we don't think this is actually very good. Because usually the cards that they wait on and don't reveal are like neutral cards or kind of the Facebook dump type cards that don't really have that much going on. It's pretty rare that you actually don't see a class card until that point. And this one is not one that I'm excited about. This is a card that costs a lot of mana for it's a 6-cost 5/5. That's not a good deal. And combo, like, you have to have played like 2 cards before you play your 6-cost 5/5 to do like 2 damage for this to be like an SI agent. I mean, like, maybe you can play like a ton of cheap spells and get a ton of damage off of this. But if you're playing a ton of cheap spells, like, isn't the 6-cost thing you're playing that turn an Auctioneer or like whatever else? Like, maybe there's a world where this is like your big burst finisher off of like a big cheap combo train, but I'm not really thinking that's very likely, and I'm not thinking this card's very good. This card, though, this is really good. Valeera the Hollow. This sort of goes into the pool of cards that I talked about as being sort of active defense for Rogue. I love this battle cry. Gain stealth into your next turn. A hero gaining stealth is something we just haven't seen in Hearthstone before. And it's obviously something that's just like super cool in terms of, well, how can a rogue defend themselves? Like, well, they disappear. They go stealth. And, that is a great way for rogues to have, an answer against things that they previously have been very vulnerable to. I played a lot of, like Jade Rogue or Thief Rogue or various mid-rangey, non-burst combo versions of Rogue on my stream over the past month or so. And one of the toughest matchups for them is always any mage deck, basically. Because you don't really kill them fast enough to like punch through their ice blocks and things before they can just set up and throw a burn at your face. And you can often get to like a point where you have like an awesome board that you can build, and maybe you're going to kill them in a couple turns, but they're just like, okay, well, I just fireball you, and you're like, oh, I'm just going to die next turn. And Valeera is obviously super cool in that they're like, okay, I play my Alexstrasza, I'm going to like burn you out next turn. You're like, nope. Not only do I gain 5 armor, which helps me survive your like Alexstrasza in itself, but also you just can't target me. I'm gone. And that does give your opponent a lot of time and ability to use their resources to instead clear off your minions and such. So it's not like you're basically just like getting a free turn. You spend a lot for this. You spent 9 mana. But then obviously the hero power of Valeera, the Shadow Reflection you get every turn, which allows you to effectively allows you to effectively copy a card that you play each turn, is very powerful. If you're in a situation where, say your opponent is about to Alexstrasza burn you out, and you have like a healing card, it's like, okay, well, actually now I have 2 healing cards. I double the effectiveness of my ability to get myself out of range of this, and that power just continues to snowball each turn. Every turn you get to duplicate something else, and that's pretty awesome. So I'm super excited for this card. I think this is a card that is going to go in pretty much all of my Rogue decks because it does so much of what I want from Rogue, which is to actually give me some kind of interactability and survivability in these longer games. And it's also just super powerful, super cool, and I'm super excited for it. I think it's one of the best cards in the set. All right, well, that is it for this review video. So thanks for watching. Let me know what you think, and I'll come back with the next 3 classes, then finally the neutral cards as I finish off my Knights of the Frozen Throne review.